So we're excited with the event today on cooperation and conflict inside and outside the Capoeira Roda, and we will see what will happen, right? Mm-hmm. So we have had the great pleasure of having Ernesto Batista Mané Jr. with us this year, and he's been a wonderful friend of the Brazil Lab, participating in multiple events, contributing with his many insights to all matters related to Brazil and beyond. So Ernesto Mané is a visiting research scholar at the Science and Global Security Program of the Woodrow Wilson School here at Princeton. He holds a PhD in nuclear physics from the University of Manchester and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Canadian Laboratory for Particle and Nuclear Physics. And he will explain to us how he transitioned from nuclear physics to capoeira, or the other way around, right? In 2014, he joined the Brazilian Diplomatic Corps and has been working in the field of disarmament and non-proliferation. And we were delighted to hear that this past year, Ernesto Mané was named by the UN as one of the 100 most influential people of African descent under 40 years old. So bravo, well done. And we have with us today as a discussant Mauricio Acunha, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. He holds a PhD in socioanthropology from the University of São Paulo and is the author of A Ginga da Nação, Intelectuais na Capoeira e Capoeiristas Intelectuais. And Mauricio's research explores how African and Afro-diasporic identities were internationally performed and imagined in Brazil, Cuba, Senegal, and the United States. So let's give Ernesto Mané and Mauricio Acunha our warmest welcome to this noon session of the Brazil Lab. In terms of format, Ernesto will talk for about 30 minutes, and then Mauricio has a set of brief comments and questions, and then we will open up the conversation to you all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, João. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Miqueias, and the Brazil Lab for welcoming me into this wonderful initiative. When I came to Princeton, I didn't know the Brazil Lab existed. So 1 week before we were packing our luggage, I started, doing some research, and it just came. And I said, wow, I'm gonna, look out for these guys. And it has been one of my greatest surprises of this year in Princeton. And thank you very much for the warm welcome. So then I suggested presenting this paper I wrote a couple of years ago, which I will read it to you. Before that, I'm just going to make a couple of remarks. So this paper was written at the end of my diplomatic training time. So Brazilian diplomats, they have to go through a 2-year training process at our Instituto Rio Branco. And at the end, the class, each young diplomat writes a paper, and then this is bundled together into a magazine. We receive a budget, and we, among ourselves, we do the edition and everything. And in 2014-15, the line that we chose to write about was capoeira and sports. At the time, we had the Brazilian Olympics. And, Brazil was a different country back then. And I decided then in that context to write about capoeira and diplomacy. So that's one of the contexts. I have been practicing capoeira for a couple of years now. And when I started my diplomatic career, I started seeing the connections between the two things. And then this is one of the motivations that I had to write this paper. And so this is what I will try to talk to you today. The other thing is, I reread the paper a few days ago, and I noticed that it may have not aged very well, given that Brazil and the world has changed so much. But I will leave it to you to judge, right? And I will ask your help to help me maybe update the paper and see if the arguments that I put forward are still applicable to today's context. Finally, whenever I mention the capoeirista practitioner in my text, I will use the feminine gender. So it will be she throughout the paper. So that's just a choice I made, and you will notice. The other thing I would like to say, I'm not a social scientist. I'm not a social academic, you know. I'm a physicist who happened to become a diplomat. And this is not an academic work. This is an essay, a collection of thoughts. And I think somehow this may be adequate to the Spirit of Brazil lab. So we are experimenting here in the lab, right? So let's start. So the paper is called Cooperation and Conflict Inside and Outside the Capoeira Roda. Brazil is considered by the international community as a reliable interlocutor and consensus builder. Indeed, we have tried to add value to the process of erecting a more just and balanced international order by leveraging exactly on these and other predicates that characterize our diplomacy. Undoubtedly, the way Brazil acts externally is closely related to its national identity, to which capoeira has contributed in a decisive way. There are therefore many points of contact between capoeira and diplomacy. Exploit them beyond the widely disseminated discourse that capoeira is part of the package of assets that underlie the country's soft power is the purpose of this essay. In the theory of international relations, cooperation occurs when actors adjust their behavior to actual or anticipated preferences through a process of policy coordination. This process usually leads to rewards for all parties involved, even if the gains are not shared equally. The conflict, however, is characterized by a result-driven behavior which seeks to reduce the gains available to others or prevent the satisfaction of their needs. Capoeira, seen in this light, is both cooperative and conflictive. This duality is present in capoeira since its origin, whose foundations have been settled in accordance to the dichotomy conformity with the establishment versus cultural resistance, both dimensions essential to the survival of this unique expression of popular culture. Not all that glitters is gold, and not everything that falters falls. In the midst of the cultural universe of capoeira, conformity is a phenomenon that is on the surface, while resistance underlies the appearances. Similarly, the duality cooperation conflict present in capoeira spills over into other environments. Externally, capoeira has spread as an unmistakable symbol of Brazilian culture. At this level, we highlight its Brazilian roots or its inclusion in the cultural goods market as a product made in Brazil. However, the conflict is established insofar as there are emerging assimilation narratives which consider capoeira no longer as purely Brazilian, but understood as a phenomenon that became part of the global culture. In addition, both at the internal and external levels, there is also a dispute over the recognition of capoeira African ancestry versus the affirmation of its Brazilianness. At this level, elements of African ancestry are normally emphasized in order to highlight these roots and to establish a counterpoint to Western culture. Capoeira has characteristics that differentiate it in various dimensions from Western practices. Because of its African heritage, it brings in other epistemic bases. More precisely, capoeira is constrained to non-Cartesian grounds. For example, the ontological hypothesis is non-existent. That is to say, it does not require a pre-existing truth to be brought to light by means of an abstract formulation. Capoeira's truths circulate in the air and are apprehended by constant practice. As far as time is concerned, capoeira's time is not linear. It is circular. The integrated teaching of elements of music, dance, fight, theater, and singing is common in African cultural manifestations, as opposed to atomized teachings of the subjects in the Western world. This way of teaching pays tribute to the African pedagogy, whose teaching method is personalized. In capoeira, learning time is each individual's own time. Another key African hallmark found in capoeira teaching is that the capoeira master not only teaches the movement, it transmits feelings. Capoeira is a cultural expression conveyed by the teacher to the students, essentially by oral tradition. For this reason, each master is a living museum with the oral tradition inherent to the way of teaching found in African customs. Learning has a deep community character. On the Capoeira Roda, the individuals are connected with the microcosm of reality represented in that context. It appears that capoeira includes numerous coexisting and often contradictory realities, embodied in a plethora of narratives constructed to cater to diverse interests. There are, however, two contemporary macro-narratives that stand out. That is, capoeira made in Brazil versus capoeira as a cultural manifestation of resistance with African origins. The point of intersection of these two planes is located at the meeting of the diachronic axis of historical successions with the synchronic axis, in which lies a succession of present-day events. In the perspective of contemporary historiography, capoeira has been read as a Black Atlantic phenomenon, and consequently a global phenomenon that went hand in hand with the colonization process of the New World, with Brazil at its epicenter. These two planes are also mark the main rift in the world of capoeira, represented by Bimba and Pastinha schools. Without seeking to find an ontology for capoeira, nor flatten these macro-narratives into gross oversimplifications, it can be said that capoeira is an African-Brazilian cultural phenomenon. Brazil was notoriously one of the main destinations of the African diaspora, so the universalized practice of capoeira in all regions of the country is a celebration of the Black people's collaboration to the formation of Brazilian identity. Moreover, as capoeira has become globalized, establishing a real network culture, it favors the possibility of reparations in the domain of historical memory and in the symbolic field of race relations. This constitutes an important mechanism that acts in relation to ideas and conceptions of racially different groups, which has a potential in the long run to allow the recognition of the role played by Black people as a source of knowledge and the reduction of racial discrimination not only in Brazil but also worldwide. Capoeira and its metaphors. Every beginner capoeirista learns through capoeira many metaphors. As a capoeirista advances in her training, she reaches a more abstract level of understanding that her art is actually a great metaphor. Arguably, the most famous of them is that capoeira can be seen as a simulacrum of the world. Capoeiristas and spectators, they gather in a circle, the Roda, within which two capoeiristas make the game, simulating and exploiting all facets and wills of individuals. The Roda is also a ritual, in which ancestral forces are summoned. The Roda brings elements which help to understand the African cosmology. It is a rite of passage between this world and the outer world. It is a crossing of the Kalunga line. For this reason, the Roda and the games have their own protocol, with a beginning, middle, and end. Despite the fact that capoeira is seemingly an activity without fixed rules, or in which the subversion of the rules seems to be the rule, it is a performance with strong foundations, having strict rules of conduct. In this regard, the capoeirista is a ceremonialist, because she organizes the Roda and the games according to these foundations. The Roda is an allegory of the wheel of life itself. It represents the dynamics of interstate relations, since it pulsates in every capoeirista the propensity for cooperation or conflict, as likewise in the relations between states. Each capoeirista is sovereign in her art, for capoeira is diffuse and decentralized, mimicking the anarchic international order. For this reason, capoeira is easily appropriated, because it deals with the uniqueness of the players. That is, the practice of capoeira advocates respect for the corporeal territoriality of each one, constituting a kind of Westphalian order for capoeira. However, as anarchic as this order may seem, it can be either cooperative or conflictive, depending necessarily on the form of interaction between the agents. Capoeira enables its practitioners to develop new strategies of belonging, which result in identity formations able to mobilize the forces of cooperation and conflict for the constitution of an international community of capoeiristas. This is perhaps the main reason capoeira has won many practitioners worldwide. Philosophically, one of the main objectives of each capoeirista is seeking to manage these two forces through self-control and self-restraint, so that the use of violence in capoeira is widely discouraged. The capoeirista must use force only in extreme situations in order to save her life. This is consistent with the century-old pacifist tradition of the Brazilian people and the cogent principle of non-use of force consecrated in contemporary interstate relations. Capoeiristas are illusionists, craftsmen in the art of concealment. As the game of capoeira reflects the pitfalls of everyday life, the mastering of deceit becomes essential to dealing with the unknown. Thus, cunning is seen as a way to equalize imbalances, in order for one to dynamically create order from chaos. The trickery in capoeira derives, therefore, from an archetypical feature of the Brazilians, which is essentially a technology to deal with a world of uncertainty, being assimilated and becoming second nature to capoeiristas. The game of capoeira is a game of bodies, but it is mostly a mental game. It is a dialogue, a discussion, a set of questions and answers made from body movements. The loser is she who fails to give an answer to a question, who runs out of arguments in the debate. It is something difficult, convoluted, tangled, complex, with indentations and subtleties that are not identifiable at first glance, requiring special attention of the players. In the same way, states and their agents need to be alert on the big chess game of interstate relations. The music played by the capoeira ensemble, comprising 3 berimbaus, 1 atabaque, 2 pandeiros, 1 agogô, and 1 reco-reco, serves to create an integrated temporal structure from which the capoeiristas move in the texture of space-time. The capoeira masters claim that a capoeirista should forget the past and the future to be able to be present in the dialogue. The time sense within the game is the instant. It is not the chronos, but the aeon, the infinitely divided time of fleeting occasion. The music has its own cadence, supported by some of the instruments, while others are free to improvisations. Indeed, the dynamics of a capoeira music ensemble obeys its own code, with elements of cooperation and conflict transposed into musical temporality. At the same time, the players improvise their movements often offbeat to the music. And the berimbau sets the tone, and experienced capoeiristas know when those moments of surprise should be performed during the game. There are no explicit winners or losers. The dialogue between the bodies is permanent, and it can branch out in various ways depending on the music, the spirit of the game, or the personal relations between the capoeiristas. The capoeira game can be cheerful, eloquent, or cooperative. It may be provocative or mockery, or occasionally conflictive. This dynamic gives all the beauty and vitality to the art. Experienced capoeiristas develop the ability to change direction in the middle of the execution of a movement, deceiving her partner, all done according to the establishment of a conversational flow apparently unpretentious. During the game, this breaking of expectations, breaking rules within the rules, are highly valued. A good capoeirista is considered one that does not have predictable movements. Capoeira movements can be performed with the intention of maintaining a fluid and cooperative interaction with the partner, or as straightforward attacks in order to integrate a set of patterns that generate high expectations with time surprise. Temporal modulation within the capoeira game causes changes in the state of awareness of the players, because they are at the heart of breaching of trust strategies. This is a powerful image that can be used to understand the acceleration of history, in which a succession of new key events arise every day, generating perplexity among stakeholders. In addition, the duality cooperation conflict in capoeira occurs in a context of imperfect information. which makes this dynamic even richer from an analytical point of view, offering new insights for understanding the game. The game has a beginning, middle, and end, but the game does not end at the Roda. The dialogue is eternal and extends to other Rodas, transcending the time horizon of the participants. This characteristic of capoeira can be analyzed from the perspective of the theory of repeated games, establishing the conditions for cooperation in ongoing relationships. Consequently, epistemic assumptions about game strategies of each capoeirista are built after years of experience playing and watching the games of other capoeiristas. Similarly to the attempts to study the behavior of states at bilateral and multilateral levels. All the above about capoeira may seem contradictory with basic assumptions of the international order that is being tentatively built, one which is grounded in institutions and international law, whose purpose is to provide stability and predictability to relations between states. However, this is not what happens. The external environment is marked by uncertainty and the behavior of actors is far from being predictable. With the emergence of new actors and new threats to international peace and security, it becomes explicit a state of affairs that is well known to the capoeiristas, who have to know how to deal with the uncertainties in the Roda in order to preserve their physical and psychological integrity. The Roda is a mirror of the international strategic environment. One can create, on the one hand, an atmosphere of tension within the Roda, which may lead to an extreme polarization of the game space, which, translated to the international level, is the same mechanism that would lead to open armed conflicts. On the other hand, cooperation is necessary to make the game fluid. In this other extreme, the individuality of capoeiristas are lost, and they merge into an amalgam. At the international level, extreme cooperation eventually leads to the erosion of barriers between states by means of the many integration processes. However, capoeira teaches that finding the balance, trust albeit distrusting, is the goal of a well-played game. In this sense, capoeira is very pragmatic. Internally, Brazilians are taught from an early age to understand that there is not a simplistic dualism in a social-cultural environment so multifaceted, with multiplicities and asymmetric, non-linear hierarchies such as the Brazilian society. Fundamentally, this is also the configuration of the external environment, composed of a myriad of states with distinct characteristics. Nuclear and non-nuclear armed states, states which are permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and those which are not. Whale states and microstates, landlocked states, island states, states with fully fledged market economies, and whose productive relations are characterized by strong state intervention, liberal and anti-liberal states, democratic states, and undemocratic ones. Brazil, for having been shaped amid extreme uncertainty in the domestic environment, knows how to navigate masterfully in the external environment, transposing to this environment the dichotomy of conformity and resistance present at the core of our society. This helps us to understand the Brazilian external behavior, and indeed, Brazil behaves multilaterally as a player that plays according to the rules, but resists assimilation processes and attempts to change the system from within. Negotiations and ambiguities. Tension settles in from the very beginning of the Capoeira Roda. This tension can be dissipated or exacerbated during the games by means of a process negotiated between capoeiristas. The Capoeira game is therefore a negotiation. In this respect, good capoeiristas are ipso facto good negotiators who will know how to use the best negotiating techniques in order to reach a satisfactory agreement. One example of these techniques is the handling of ambiguity and precision. Precise movements, both offensive and defensive ones, may be needed at decisive moments. Similarly, ambiguity proves to be the refuge of the capoeirista who is at disadvantage. Just as the particle wave duality in quantum physics, in which objects express different aspects of their nature, depending on the interaction with the environment, a capoeirista will present a particle-like or a diffuse behavior, depending on the interaction with other capoeiristas. A capoeirista must know well her limits and alternatives to the question posed by the opponent in order to know when to say yes or to say no. Ultimately, the ideal game is one that aims to be an integrative negotiation. That is, a balance between competition and cooperation. Just as in diplomacy, the way the negotiation is being treated in capoeira becomes as important as what is being negotiated. Furthermore, capoeiristas usually build permanent relations between them, and that can affect positively or negatively the ongoing game. For this reason, it is common for capoeiristas to seek in the present to compensate for something negative that occurred in the past game. Outside observers may be oblivious to certain behaviors displayed by the players, but those who know the history of those who are playing in the Roda will have better conditions to find the causal links and make a more accurate interpretation of the game. Very often, states explore ambiguity and precision in diplomatic language, using a technique known as constructive ambiguity. Indeed, the level of fluidity with which Brazil navigates at the multilateral level reveals the mastery of these tools as a locus of excellence of Brazilian diplomacy. We are ambiguous and we are precise, particularly in order to accommodate interests. The pattern of involvement of Brazil in norm-making shows, therefore, the use of conformative and resistance strategies at a practical level. Now, to conclude, all the above leads us to believe that there is an isomorphism between the capoeiristas and the Brazilian diplomats. Analyzing one can help us to understand aspects of the other. Well, if the Brazilian diplomat possesses features such as technical training, circumspection, gravitas, adherence to rules of conduct, delicacy of manners, refinement and cunning in relations with others, these features are also found in capoeiristas. The capoeirista, in turn, is above all a person who promotes the cultural and values of the Brazilian people in Brazil and abroad. She is also a ceremonialist because she deals with symbols and with the enactment of rituals. She is also a negotiator, knowing how to best use ambiguity and precision to achieve her goals. To perform these functions well, the capoeirista makes use of refinement and education. After all, Mestre Pastinha said once that capoeira is loving. It is not perverse. It is a polite habit we cultivate within us. It is an unprepossessing thing. Thank you.
So we'll hear now from Mauricio, and then we'll open up to comments and questions.
Is that possible just to connect, just to show an image, if possible, of the beautiful publication that he can show us? There are two beautiful pictures that I just want to share with you. Obrigado, Miquel.
Tá bom.
Obrigado. Muito obrigado. Well, thank you for the invitation, for this conversation, and this amazing presentation delivered by Ernesto Mané, diplomat and capoeirista, right? And I just gonna give some remarks, but before I'd like to show up these two images that we can see in this Brazilian version, because there are two versions of this paper, right? One in English, one in Portuguese. So this is the Brazilian version. We have this image like opening the text, and then by the end we can observe this last one. And I just want to mention briefly at some moment these beautiful images. So let's look like this. Right. Well, oi sim sim sim, oi não não não. Or like in a brutal translation. Oh yes, yes, yes. Oh no, no, no. This is an important capoeira song, right? So, how to build up a diplomacy departing from so simple words as the affirmation and negation of something. A yes and a no constantly repeated by the voices in a circle of capoeira, a roda de capoeira.
a relational body practice that seems to repeat in movements the affirmation and negation listening through the songs. From these melodies and bodies, however, Ernesto Mané sheds light over the metaphors and rituals to show up, and I quote, a mirror of the international strategic environment, end quote. He states, for example, the Roda de Capoeira as a simulacrum in which the bodies are similar to the states in international relations. He proposed, on the one hand, there is a risk of excessive cooperation disintegrating the differences between nations, and on the other hand, an extreme individuality leading to war and mutual destruction. But, as suggested by the images of the Roda de Capoeira and the circular tables at the United Nations, negotiations are possible and needed within a Brazilian democracy, and I quote again, consistent to a century-old pacifist tradition of the Brazilian people, end quote. As Ernesto Mané invites us, and he is an expert practitioner of this constructive ambiguity in the capoeira and diplomatic relations, and diplomatic negotiations, let's turn back to capoeira. Oh, yes, 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 oh, no, no, no. This song is part of an incalculable repertoire of capoeira songs and memories. In the case of this particular song, what follows is a short chronicle of the Second World War. And I quote, in a translation, of course. We can sing later, right, Ernesto?
Berimbau here.
Yeah. Well, the Brazilian government say that he has, the Japanese government say that do not has, a powerful ship squadron to fight against the Germans. That's a brutal translation of this lyric. No? Therefore, the asymmetries of history modifying the ambiguous synchrony and shapes a symphony of voices that we imagine as a popular tradition. From this perspective, I would like to invite Ernesto Mané to a new round of reflection about Brazilian diplomacy and the capoeira as an Afro-diasporic cultural expression. What is the role of history in the consolidation and transformation of the convergence between the diplomat and the capoeira? And Ernesto, if possible, you can also add a note about the gender issues in both fields. If you consider history as important, what would be the key moments to the convergence between diplomacy and capoeira? Second, I invite you to comment about the long-term approach of the Brazilian state over the capoeira during the 20th century to build up, and this is just an invitation to the debate, a kind of populist simulacrums. And please, let's not forget the capoeira was a sort of practice against the social and political order during the colonial period and the Brazilian Empire. The Republic, inaugurated by a military coup in 1889, organized an extreme form of repression, defining capoeira as a crime, and the punishment to practitioners was the deportation to Fernando de Noronha, a distant island in the northeast of the country. As I understood, Ernesto, it was under that repression that capoeira shaped the main features you have described to a comparison with diplomacy. The President Getúlio Vargas decriminalized the capoeira in 1937, and not by chance, he was the same who inaugurated our populist era. Maybe it was not a coincidence that Getúlio Vargas was the first president to conceive capoeira as a national sport. So, I would like to hear you more about the implications of capoeira as a sport and as a model of diplomacy in the Vargas era, and he was the one who negotiated a yes or a no to the Allies and the Axis in the Second World War. Finally, I want to ask you about the current Brazilian diplomacy.
the updates, right? As many have observed, there is a radical shift in the diplomatic orientation of Brazil today. Maybe the most important mutation since the origins of a pacifist orientation under the guidance of Barão do Rio Branco, the patron of Brazilian diplomacy. Between the total alignment to the White House orientations and the loss of relevant positions hardly achieved along the decades by diplomats, what can we learn from capoeira within this context? Accordion Man of Sérgio Buarque de Holanda's book, with his fragile balance between violence and hurtness, looks like the model of the capoeirista you have described. If that is so, what happens when, according to Alexandre de Freitas Barbosa, a bestial man erupts in the public sphere of a formal democratic society? Compared to the cordial man, the bestial would operate only in a negative way, aiming to destroy mediation and to extend the conflicts. To mention a few examples, this new diplomacy would include the support to the US assassination of an Iranian general in Iraq, the deportation of Brazilian undocumented immigrants from the US, and a plausible war against Venezuela. Are there possible analogies or isomorphisms between the diplomacy of a bestial man and the capoeira? Or do you think that capoeira will follow an orientation against the state, nurturing what the African Brazilian writer Conceição Evaristo called the marroning of the world, or the aquilombamento do mundo? Thank you.
Wow. Okay, so now we will get some initial comments from Ernesto, and then we'll open up to your own comments and questions. Thank you, Mauricio.
Okay. So thank you very much, Mauricio, for your wonderful comments and questions. I'll see how successful I will be in answering your very provocative points in the end. So from what I wrote down here, I will start with the key moments for the convergence of diplomacy and capoeira in Brazilian history. You're right, you talked about Getúlio Vargas. He was instrumental to decriminalize capoeira. And he was also the one who popularized samba in Brazil. So, and my impression is that Getúlio Vargas, he did that because he understood that he needed to get the support of the Brazilian people. You mentioned populism. Brazil was transitioning from basically an agrarian economy to beginning its industrialization process, which meant that you needed to create a new ethos for workers. And I understand this strategy basically as co-opting Brazilian cultural expressions in order to conform the Brazilian people into this new logic of capitalist exploitation in Brazil. So, on the other hand, capoeira itself needed to sort of constantly update itself in order to survive. Capoeira is primarily, in my understanding, motivated by survival of people. This is a very concrete problem that we had to deal with and develop a technology of survival, of resistance. So I think when Bimba, for instance, he was Mestre Bimba, maybe some of you don't know him, he was the person who created the first capoeira studio to teach white people in the cities capoeira, and members of the Brazilian elite to learn capoeira with him. He was the first one who codified capoeira, meaning that before, capoeira was transmitted only by oral tradition, and he was the one who started creating a kata of capoeira, giving a systematic approach to teaching capoeira, and in that way capoeira became mainstream. One can argue that this was also a strategy to survive, and somehow this was inevitable for capoeira to become part of the mainstream, and capoeira in that respect was also shaped by this mainstream, but it also influenced the mainstream in many ways, and that's one of the things that I try to point in this essay. But I would say that in terms of, well, you mentioned the World War II and Vargas' approach to it and how capoeira played a role there. I would say that Vargas, yes, he was very ambiguous during the war between the Allies and the Axis, right? And at one point, he had to make a decision, and Brazil joined the Allies, joined forces with the Allies, and the rest, what happened. But what Vargas did at the time, he tried to maximize the gains from playing both sides, and he was very successful in that way, because both the Germans and the U.S. Managed to contribute a lot to the industrialization process of Brazil at the time, right? So he played that very well, the ambiguity. What else? Another key moment, I would say, was the 60s, right? And I think that's the object of your research. There was this international festival for black arts, right, in Senegal, and Brazil sent a delegation of artists, and among them masters, capoeirista masters. They went there, and of course this initiative had the organization of this initiative was made by Itamaraty at the time, by the Brazilian Ministry of External Relations. And then one has to understand what was happening with the African continent at that time. We had this decolonization process, the first wave of decolonization in the 60s, then we had another one in the 70s. The Portuguese-speaking colonies came later, right? Maybe Jean-Biel didn't say, but maybe I should add a note to my own biography. My father, he's from Guinea-Bissau. And so the country became independent in 1974, right? And in 1978, he fled. He left Guinea-Bissau, and then he went to Brazil to study economics at USP with a scholarship given by Itamaraty, by the Brazilian Ministry of External Relations. And you may argue, why is Itamaraty interested in doing that? Well, because Brazil saw that in its sort of regional geographical area, it was important to become a pole of attraction of these new established African countries, and mainly the Portuguese-speaking countries. One should not forget that if you go back all the way to the time when Brazil became independent from Portugal, one of the clauses for the acceptance of Brazilian independence, Portugal stated very clear that it wanted Brazil out of its territories in Africa, and Brazil had to acquiesce to that. So from basically the 1800s all the way to 1960s, Brazil was not doing much in the African continent, right? And this changed, and this was part of a reorientation of our external policy in order to, as I said, to become to influence the continent. Don't forget, we had the Cold War also at the time, and things were very, very difficult. So in that context, I think, Brazilian elites, they thought that they could use these expressions of Brazilian culture as a bridge to sort of tighten relations with these new states. So I see that in that respect. And this is not very much different from what we hear today, when even in previous governments, whenever we talk about the relationship between Brazil and African countries, we talk about our sort of common heritage, our culture, So this culturalist sort of element is present, but the seeds were planted, I would say, back in the 60s, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe I could sort of postpone answering the questions about what has happening in the present day to another round of questions, so I can collect more views from other people. I think would be good.
Great. So let's collect the first bundles of questions in this Roda. Yeah, Lucas?
So maybe drawing from just the last point you mentioned, Ernesto. And first, thank you very much for both of you, Ernesto and Mauricio. I learned a lot, and your reflections and arguments are fascinating. Thank you. I'm interested in drawing also from Mauricio's last set of questions. I'm interested in the relations between Brazilian diplomacy and the social or Brazilian society in general, but especially like nowadays, like in the current moment, because from your paper there's a lot on the history of capoeira and all the correlations you made with epistemic knowledges and etc. There's a lot between like bridging society, Brazilian society, and diplomacy and capoeira, especially these ideas of negotiations, belonging. You use that too, and while I was hearing that, I couldn't stop myself to think about like the current social and political polarization. And this is something that Brazil Lab have been talking a lot in this space. Last semester we had Ilona Zabó, for example, and she had this argument, this point that maybe it's time to, she was problematizing how peaceful Brazilians and the Brazilian culture is and has been, and she had this argument that maybe it's time to start to shift our analysis towards this idea that there is perhaps some inherent kind of violence or something like that, some animosity or oppositions. And so in this broad political sense, I was wondering what are your thoughts, because this kind of like goes against the ideas of like non-violence, peaceful, etc. that you use, not only you, like I think everyone in this room has used a lot when thinking about the Brazilian society and everything, and how these current issues may impact this tradition in diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, Maria?
Yes. Thank you very much. This was so beautiful to hear. What a beautiful piece. I was really touched by your approach, and then by Mauricio questions and comments. So thank you very much. It was beautiful to hear. And I would love that Brazil would have capoeiristas governing us.
I don't know.
It's a kind of utopian.
Answer that.
What a beautiful country.
Especially a her, right?
Yes, especially a her. But so I'd like to hear a little bit more about what Mauricio says about this against the state. So how you had used the word cooptation, right? So how I do think that you pointed to a conflict that we have, that is how beautiful the Brazilian culture is based on these rituals and these inheritances, and how badly we are with our politics. So this, right? So how bad we are treated, right? So this opposition, and so this is one. So this against the state, and at the same time being co-opted. And the second question is, would you, I don't know if you have time, but if you can expand the question of the capoeiristas for another Brazilian identity key, that is mestiçage and African ancestry together. So, yeah, if you have some thoughts about that.
Yes, please.
Thank you both very much. I wanted to know if you would speak to Mauricio's question on gender. I'm interested in that. So I'm interested more from the cultural exploration side of things than the diplomacy side, but I appreciated the connection. And I wanted to just comment and then see what your reflections might be on, you talked about capoeira in the diaspora and being a worldwide phenomenon. In my research on cultural implications of identity like gender and race, I'm finding in the capoeira world that I can ask those questions of Brazilian capoeiristas. I can ask those questions of capoeiristas who are Africans in America, of African descent. But when you propose those same questions about gender or race to a group that is more self-identified as more maybe themselves calling themselves more metropolitan, more diverse, we're beyond those problems now, a wall goes up. And that comment that you made about conflict versus cooperation, and when you remove conflict completely and you have over-cooperation, that struck me as related to that, because then you're removing an issue that needs to be talked about in order to kind of pretty it up. Say, well, we're okay in this circle, in this hole that we're okay, we don't have those problems. And a lot of times they still do, but they just won't talk about it. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Okay.
Yes, I had a question to that follows Mauricio's and Lucas and some of the other comments about this century-old pacifist culture, right? If I recall well, Ilona Fabo said we need to let go. We have never been cordial. We have been brutal since the beginning. Maybe the bestial man is not just, a late modern, late liberal capitalist apparition. Maybe it has been part of what made Brazil from the beginning. So, but there's a beauty in the way you perform the text. You read it. You're doing something of the yes, 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 no, 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 in the very ways you're doing this isomorphic blending of, states relating to each other, and the capoeira dança. But so maybe my question follows the question then of the role of history, but also pushing it more to how your analytic can probe the cultural construction historically of Brazil. And because you said maybe I need to update, but does this update lead you to rethink also the cultural tropes that you played with as well?
Very good. Right, so
Second article on its way.
exactly. So how do I start here? First, I would like to mention that in 2014, capoeira has become recognized by UNESCO as immaterial cultural heritage, right? And that's remarkable. And again, that has a lot to do with the activities of our diplomats in promoting and UNESCO is a very, as any other multilateral organization, it is a very politicized environment. And you may think that, cultural heritage, who cares about it? But people, they fight over these things as well. So the fact that capoeira has been recognized is something that we should not overlook. as I said, I mean, I wrote this paper in 2014. It's interesting. In 2015, there is another very well-known capoeira master, Mestre João Grande. He was a student of Mestre Pastinha, who is like one of the founding fathers of capoeira Angola. And he lives here in New York. He's been living here for like over 30, almost 40 years now. And then in 2015, he went to Brazil to receive a medal from the Ministry of Culture for all his legacy and everything, right? It's very hard for me to imagine that this would happen in today's context. And one of the objectives of this paper, and even rereading this, I'm trying to reconnect Brazil with itself in a way. Of course, and this leads to the question about mestiçagem. Capoeira is a mestiço by definition, because some Africans, they were taken to Brazil and then they've perfected and changed the techniques that they brought, you know, the martial arts and so on in Brazil. But the songs are sung in Portuguese, and we had also some argue the contribution of the indigenous people as well, capoeira. So capoeira is mestiço by definition. It is a sort of an Atlantic manifestation, I would say. But there is an African root, and we should not forget. And I think that somehow, it's difficult to articulate that in a very precise way, but I see that Brazilian society is kind of structurally changing nowadays. And it's sort of, its own character, its own identity is changing in a way. And for example, when we talk about the African Brazilian religions that are under attack in many places of the country, and I see that this is an attempt to erase a very important component of our own identity. So when I bring that to the table, it is an attempt to let's not forget who we are also, right? So in that sense, I think capoeira, it can be very conflictive. Like capoeiristas in Rio de Janeiro, when we had the end of the empire and the onset of the republic, there were like very violent conflicts with the police at the time. And in Rio de Janeiro, capoeira was almost wiped out because it was repressed very, very violently. There were like the Maltas, right, which were like almost like militias of capoeiristas. And this was seen by the elites as a threat. And I remember when Lily Schwartz was here, I asked her about Haitianism. And it has always been a fear in Brazilian among Brazilian elites that the Brazilian lower classes, the black population, indigenous people would revolt, like the same way they did in Haiti. So this fear has not completely disappeared, and it is very difficult to try and do some kind of social engineering in a way that you try to keep a large portion of the population that does not have its basic needs fulfilled under control. And to me, it is magic that this happens in Brazil. Of course, when I say that Brazilian tradition is pacifist, I mean to the external, outside its borders, right? I do not talk about much what happens inside Brazil. And in fact, Brazil hasn't been in war with its neighbors for almost 150 years. And in every moment, Brazil has engaged in military actions during the 20th century. It was under the guise of multilateral institutions. So I mean, as a diplomat, we do believe in the value added by the constitution of multilateral institutions. and we do that. We do so because there is also a very pragmatic reason for that. If you believe in the rule of law, being on the weak side, it protects you from, aggression, from the law of the strongest. So in that way, I think that I try to address your questions. Gender in capoeira. This is why I decided to refer to the capoeirista as a woman here. I've, as a practitioner, I've seen this. This is a problem. But in the beginning, capoeira was mainly performed by men, right? And for the last maybe 30 years or so, there has been now more and more women in capoeira. You have now capoeira mestras. Even some songs sang in capoeira were considered sexist and are no longer played, So it is a difficult but necessary change. Some old masters, for instance, they wouldn't allow the woman to play certain instruments. And for example, the atabaque or the berimbau gunga, the main one, and some of them wouldn't allow that to happen when they were like in their periods, and this has some spiritual, whatever reason, and this has been challenged, and now you have more and more women practicing capoeira, leading groups, teaching, not only in Brazil but worldwide. Capoeira, I mean, yesterday I saw a video of a capoeira group in Siberia, and they're playing capoeira in the snow. There's capoeira in Japan. There's capoeira in the Palestine. Capoeira is now also in Africa. Some people from Brazil are also opening schools in Africa. So capoeira is virtually everywhere, and that's why I say that it's difficult. It may no longer be a Brazilian art form, but now it's really a global thing. And I feel that everyone in contact with capoeira tries to draw from it something that sort of corresponds to their own wishes, right? So, and capoeira is able to provide, because it's so multifaceted, that it can provide sort of answers for people who come from different backgrounds.
But there is still a mecca, right?
There is, of course. There is, of course.
Still can find people that go to visit to pilgrims that go to Salvador, right?
To Salvador, yeah. What else I have here? Yeah, I mean, this question about Brazilian society being violent, being non-violent. I mean, if we compare, for instance, with what happens here in the United States, you have all these mass shootings in the schools. I mean, I don't have the statistics to say, but most of it is probably performed not by the Latino people or by the African Americans, right? It's not. Which and these groups, the underrepresented groups, one would argue that they would have many reasons to revolt, and take action, but they haven't. In the past, the Black Panthers, they did something, but they were also severely repressed. And also my impression is that it's a question of survival. So if you go and you want to really challenge the status quo, you'll be outnumbered, you'll be badly repressed. So you have to develop other strategies to survive. And I think capoeira also plays in that context. Another thing that I would like to say, capoeira is very dynamic, so is Brazilian society. We have this extreme polarization in Brazil right now, but this will pass. We don't know what will happen next, but this will pass. Brazil we have 200 million people there, It's a very dynamic society. As far as capoeira goes, for example, I mean, so many things I would like to say, but now the evangelicals also, some of them practice capoeira. And they bring religious songs into capoeira. African Brazilians from Candomblé, they also want to sort of emphasize the African roots of capoeira and its deep connections with the African Brazilian religions. And then you talk about Ogunga, you talk about Oxalá, you talk about Oxóssi and all the Orishas. But the capoeiristas that are evangelicals, they don't want to hear anything about that. They want to talk about Jesus. And so you have this happening inside capoeira. And by no means capoeira is a monolithic sort of thing. It's everyone does its own thing, you know. It's extremely anarchic, decentralized. Nobody owns capoeira. This is good in one way and bad in another way, because good meaning that, you know, if I want to start a capoeira school here in Princeton, nobody's going to stop me from doing that. On the other hand, you may have people who will sort of change the foundation so much that the art is no longer recognizable. And everything is happening at the same time. You know, everything, it's very dynamic.
So we open for a second round of questions. Then we'll ask Mauricio to offer some more comments. Do we have any additional questions? Do you want to add something, Mauricio?
Yes, maybe I just...
You know, because there was a lot built into your very thought-provoking and probing questions.
No, it was, well, if I would add something, that should be about this question of the violent Brazilian society, that I think that we have some romanticized readings of some works in the Brazilian social thought, let's say. Because if we need to return with other lens to that kind of readings, and I'm talking about some classics, let's say like Sérgio Buarque de Holanda and The Cordial Man, or Gilberto Freire and The Master and Slaves. Well, they're readings and essays like full of violence, you know, and the problems that connects like this idea of cordial man with the most bestial like features. So, but I think that we're like in the right moment of reread, you know, that kind of works with other perspective, you know? And I also want to thank, because you are like in the diplomatic corps, you know, and doing that kind of effort in building and writing an essay like that in a very nice, you know, publication like this one from the Itamaraty, you know, as we know how the diplomatic corps are in terms of race, gender issues. So it's very nice to have that kind of contribution, you know? And I think that it offers like a good road to that kind of the debates, and to think about the updates that we can have, you know, departing from those arguments and this kind of phenomenology of the movements, no, and this hermeneutic that we can find in the songs, in the bodies, and in the different groups of capoeiras that we found today, like in more than 200 countries around the world. No?
Yeah, this is, you know, someone once said, you know, this elitist sort of thought in Brazil that, you know, the most mediocre Bach symphony is much better than the best Brazilian batucada. I mean, some people say that. They have said that for many years, and they are still saying that nowadays. And, I mean, a very sort of blunt counter-argument is like, look at what we have already offered to the world. There are capoeira is like in almost every... There are capoeira groups in every state in the U.S. It's capoeira, as I said, in Russia, in Japan, in Ukraine. Capoeira in Latin America, all of it. Central America, in Mexico, all of Europe, Eastern Europe, you know. Capoeira is everywhere. And I think it has proven its own value by, as I said, what it can offer in terms of dance, theater, martial arts, the community it builds, and it, as I said in this article, it is a technology, right? And people recognize its value, otherwise they wouldn't have been practicing it.
think it's so beautiful in what you said also about it being a living museum, but also at the end now you're talking more like a laboratory of sorts, a technology, there's some kind of reinventation going on there that somehow is owned by no one. And it is also owned, so it's the paradox, right? And I think that's the beauty, I think,
Yeah.
of what you try to capture through the way you read it into this very wide and hierarchical and strategic-minded milieu of the diplomacy.
And this paper was written for diplomats,
Yeah.
right?
Well done.
Yeah,
well done, Ernesto Mané.
Yeah.
Well done, Mauricio Cunha. Thank you, guys.